What if the most terrifying thing about war wasn't the enemy you could see, but the one that followed you home, not in your memories, but in your very presence? What if some soldiers returned from the battlefield changed in ways that couldn't be explained by trauma alone, their comrades swearing that something fundamental had shifted in them during those final days before extraction? This is the story of what happened to the men of Bravo Company in the winter of 1943, in the mountains of northern Albania. It's a story that official records barely acknowledge, that survivors refuse to discuss for decades, and then only now, with most of them gone, is finally being pieced together from letters, interviews, and accounts that were never meant to be public. You're listening to Trench Shadows. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We explore the stories that history tried to bury, and the ones that won't stay buried. This is one of them. The winter of 1943 was brutal across all European theaters. The Allies were pushing into territory that had been held by Axis forces for years, and the Balkans, that fractured, mountainous spine of Southeast Europe, were proving to be one of the most punishing campaigns of the entire war. Not because of the scale of the battles, but because of the isolation, the terrain, and the fact that nobody really understood what was happening there. By late November, American and British forces were supporting multiple resistance groups in the region. The politics were murky. The communists were fighting the fascists, and we were fighting both in some places, allied with both in others. In the mountains of Albania, geography was destiny. Valleys were passes, passes were choke points, and choke points were where you either made your stand or you died. Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 91st Infantry Regiment, had been assigned to a forward position near a place called Kochi, a small village nestled in a valley that was strategically important for controlling movement along the northern routes. The company was undermanned, about 100 men instead of the full complement of 19. They were tired, they were far from resupply lines, and they were about to face something that their training had never prepared them for. The men stationed there that November came from all over America. There were guys from Detroit, from Tennessee, from California. There was Private James Whitmore from Kentucky, a coal miner's son who'd written letters home describing the beauty of the Albanian mountains, the snow on the peaks, the way the light fell through the pines. There was Sergeant Marcus Hale, a career soldier from Georgia who kept morale up with old war stories and a dark sense of humor. And there was Captain David Reinhardt, 32 years old, a West Point graduate who was respected by his men but not loved, not yet anyway. Captain Reinhardt's command style was methodical. He ran the camp with efficiency. Watches were kept, patrols were scheduled, food was rationed carefully. They maintained discipline in a place where discipline was the only thing keeping men sane. The first weeks at Kochi were, by the standards of 1943, almost peaceful. There were no active combat operations. The company's job was to hold position, gather intelligence on German and Italian movements, and support local partisan fighters who would come through the camp seeking supplies or information. The routine became almost meditative. Men would wake before dawn, coffee made from whatever beans could be sourced locally, mixed with precious American condensed milk, guard rotations, maintenance of weapons and equipment, inventory of supplies, meals prepared in a communal kitchen set up in an old stone structure that might have been a barn or a stable before the war made structures into something else entirely. Private Whitmore kept a journal. In one entry from December 3rd, he wrote, "The mountains here are unlike anything I've ever seen, not like home at all. There's something about them that makes you feel very small. In the evenings, when the light is leaving and the shadows get long, you can almost forget there's a war on, almost. But almost is never enough. Almost is where the unease begins." The first sign that something was wrong came on December 8th. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make it into an official report. Sergeant Hale noticed that the perimeter dogs, 3 dogs that had been kept by the company for security and early warning, had stopped eating. They'd stop at their food bowls and just stand there, trembling. Then they'd back away. All 3 of them exhibited the same behavior. They seemed afraid. Captain Reinhardt didn't think much of it at first. Dogs got sick. Animals in war zones were stressed. He ordered the dogs to be moved closer to the quarters, given extra attention. But the trembling continued. And then, on the night of December 11th, all 3 dogs died, not from injury. Not from sickness that anyone could identify. They simply stopped living. Their bodies were found stiff in the morning, eyes still open, expressions locked in what looked like terror. When you're isolated in a mountain valley during wartime, even small things take on weight. The death of the dog circulated through camp as a topic of conversation. Nervous conversation, the kind that doesn't lead anywhere but doesn't quite die either. What happened next came in fragments, details that seemed unrelated, observations that nobody connected until much later. On December 12th, Private Robert Chen, a radio operator, reported that he'd been listening to communications traffic late into the night, like someone running their voice through something, like it was being distorted or transmitted from very far away. He heard it for about 30 seconds, and then it was gone. Chen told Sergeant Hale about it. Hale told Captain Reinhardt. Around the same time, soldiers began reporting other things. Strange sounds coming from the woods beyond the perimeter. Not wolves, the men knew what wolves sounded like. Not wind in the trees. These sounds seemed to have intention to them. Private Walter Oakes, a sharpshooter from Nebraska, reported seeing movement in the tree line on the night of December 14th. He was doing a watch rotation on the northern edge of camp. He saw what he described as a figure, tall and wrong-looking, moving between the pines. He tried to get a clean sight picture with his rifle, but by the time he'd adjusted, it was gone. When he reported it to the sergeant of the guard, he was met with skepticism. Probably a partisan scout, he was told. Probably just shadows. But Oakes knew the difference between shadows and a figure that moved with purpose. Morale, which had been steady, began to fray. Men stopped sleeping deeply. Conversations grew quieter. There was a quality of listening to the camp now, even during the day, listening for something. Captain Reinhardt called a meeting with his encos on December 16th. According to notes that Sergeant Hale kept notes that only surfaced decades later, Reinhardt was dismissive of the reports. He attributed the incidents to stress, isolation, and the psychological weight of being deployed in unfamiliar territory. He ordered increased security protocols but emphasized that there was likely a rational explanation for everything. Soldiers, he said, see what they expect to see. We're going to see clearly. We're going to stay disciplined. It was the right command decision. It was also the one that kept him from taking precautions that might have mattered. On December 18th, a partisan group came through camp, 6 men, led by a fighter named Murit, who'd been working with the Americans since October. Murit was grizzled, efficient, and he seemed to know the mountains like a man knows his own house. He came to report on German positions to the north and to resupply his group's ammunition. While his men ate, Murat pulled Captain Reinhardt aside, according to Reinhardt's account given only once. To a military psychiatrist in 1945, Murit asked if the Americans had seen the thing. What thing? Reinhardt asked. Murit was reluctant to explain. He didn't believe in it, he said. But his people, the local resistance fighters, they'd been talking about something in the mountains, something that had started appearing maybe 2 weeks prior. It moved at night. It didn't hunt the way wolves hunt. It didn't track the way men track. Reinhardt asked Murit if he'd seen it himself. Murit had not, but people he trusted had, people who'd been in these mountains their whole lives, people who knew the difference between fear and a real threat. Reinhardt didn't get more details. Murit and his men left the next morning, but before they left, Murit took Sergeant Hale aside and told him something that Hale never officially reported, but that he mentioned in a letter to his sister in 1948. Tell your men to stay close together. Tell them not to wander. Tell them that the thing that walks here, it takes people when they're alone. It takes them, and they don't come back right. That warning, transmitted informally, created a different kind of fear. Not the fear of combat, not the fear of shelling or aerial bombardment. This was a fear that had no clear target, no clear defense. This was the fear of something that might not follow the rules of war. On December 20th, Private Matthew Soros went missing. Soros was a quiet kid, 19 years old, from upstate New York. He'd been assigned to water detail, carrying supplies to the stream that ran at the western edge of camp. He'd taken 2 men with him as protocol required, but somewhere along the path, he'd fallen behind. The other 2 said he'd stopped to adjust his pack. They continued on. When they came back, Soros wasn't there. Captain Reinhardt organized a search. 40 soldiers, divided into teams, combing the area around the stream and the woods beyond. They found nothing, no blood, no sign of struggle, no trail leading away from the path. It was as if Soros had simply ceased to exist at that particular point in space. That night, the camp was silent in a way that silence can be terrible. Men sat with their weapons, not sleeping, not talking, just waiting for something they couldn't name. 2 days later, on December 22nd, Private Soros walked out of the woods and into the camp. He appeared at dawn, walking slowly through the main gate like he was coming back from an evening stroll. Except it had been 2 days. Except his uniform was torn and muddy. Except his eyes were different. That's what the men noticed first, according to accounts they gave later. His eyes, Whitmore wrote in his journal. Soros came back and everything about his face was the same, but his eyes were wrong. Like something was looking out through them that wasn't Matthew Soros. Captain Reinhardt immediately isolated Soros, brought him into the command tent, and questioned him personally. What followed is detailed in Reinhardt's own statement, which he gave to medical personnel and which was filed away in psychiatric records that didn't see daylight for 60 years. Soros couldn't explain where he'd been. When asked directly, he said he'd been with it. When asked what it was, he couldn't or wouldn't describe it. His fingernails were torn and bleeding, as if he'd been clawing at something, but he said he didn't remember how he'd gotten them that way. Reinhardt had him examined by the company medic, Private Jerome Walsh. Walsh found nothing wrong physically, except for the damaged nails and a strange mark on Soros's shoulder blade, a mark that looked like it had been burned into the skin, but not with heat. It was raised and dark, and when Walsh tried to examine it closely, Soros flinched away with an intensity that suggested genuine pain. Walsh later described the mark as resembling a handprint, but wrong. The proportions were off. The fingers were too long. Soros was put in isolation in a small stone structure near the supply tent that was used for storage, and Reinhardt made a decision that, in his own words, he would regret for the rest of his life. He didn't report it. He didn't radio battalion headquarters. He didn't document it officially. He quarantined Soros, posted guards, and told his officers that Soros had suffered a breakdown due to stress and was being observed for medical evaluation. But men talk, men in close quarters, afraid and isolated, talk constantly. Within hours, everyone in Bravo Company knew that something had taken Soros and something had brought him back. On December 23rd, Captain Reinhardt called a company meeting, all officers and senior ANCOs. This is where the historical record becomes clearer, because Sergeant Hale's personal diary survives, and his description of that meeting is detailed and vivid. Reinhardt was, by Hale's account, a changed man. The efficiency had been replaced by something else. Hale described him as making decisions like a man playing chess in the dark, moving pieces without being sure where they'd land. Reinhardt laid out what they knew and what they didn't. Something was in the mountains. It had taken Private Soros. Soros had returned, but altered in some fundamental way. It was likely to attempt another abduction. The question was what they could do about an enemy that had no known weakness, no known pattern, and that couldn't be killed because it hadn't been identified as anything that could be killed. The options were stark. They could abandon the position and retreat to the next camp, about 40 miles south and accessible only through mountain passes that would take 3 to 4 days to traverse. Or they could stay and establish defenses strong enough to protect the camp. The problem with retreat was logistics. They had wounded men. They had limited supplies for such a journey. They had no guarantee that whatever was in the mountains wouldn't follow them down the passes. And from a military perspective, abandoning a strategic position would require explanation to battalion command, which meant reporting what had actually happened. The problem with staying was obvious. Something was actively hunting them. In the end, Reinhardt made the decision that defines what happened next. They would stay. They would fortify the camp. They would establish guard rotations that kept men from being isolated, and they would prepare for a confrontation. Sergeant Hale, in his notes, wrote, "The captain said we would meet it on our terms." I don't think he believed that. I don't think any of us did, but orders are orders, and in war you don't often get the luxury of choosing what you're afraid of. The next 4 days, December 23rd through 27th, were spent transforming the camp into something resembling a fortress. Soldiers constructed additional barriers. They cut sight lines through the forest around the perimeter, creating killing zones. They positioned machine gunners at strategic points. They set up flares that could be ignited if anything breached the wire. Captain Reinhardt, falling back on his West Point training, organized the camp into defensive sectors, each with an assigned squad and specific fields of fire. But it was defensive against what? That was the question no one could answer. You can't defend against something you don't understand. Private Whitmore's journal entries from this period are sparse and increasingly troubled. One entry reads, "We're preparing for a battle, but we don't know the enemy. We've set up as if we're expecting Germans in the morning, but that's not what's coming. Something in the woods, something that doesn't follow the rules." Soros remained in isolation. Reinhardt visited him daily, trying to extract more information, more details, anything that could be used as intelligence. But Soros remained largely uncommunicative. He would sit in the cold stone room and stare at nothing. He wouldn't eat. He would drink water, but only if someone placed it directly in front of him. And at night, according to the guards, he would stand at the small window of his isolation room and look out toward the woods. On December 26th, one of the guards, Private David Corman, reported that Soros had whispered something while staring into the darkness. Corman had asked him to repeat it. Soros said, "It's coming back. It wants to finish what it started." Fear, which had been simmering, began to boil. That night, Captain Reinhardt made a decision that he would later describe as, "The moment I understood that some situations don't have solutions, only outcomes." He ordered the men to prepare for what he called an active defensive engagement the following night. They would fortify further. They would maintain full alert status. And when if something came, they would make their stand. He didn't say they would survive it. He didn't promise victory. He just said they would stand. The weather changed that evening. The temperature plummeted. Clouds moved in, and by sunset, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Snow began to fall light at first, then heavier. By midnight, the world beyond the camp's perimeter had disappeared entirely into white. Men stood at their posts, wrapped in everything they had. They breathed into their hands. They shifted their weight constantly to keep blood flowing to their extremities. They watched the whiteness, knowing that in that whiteness, something was watching back. Around 2 a.m., Private Chen, the radio operator, reported something on the frequency that had been active before. But this time it wasn't a distorted voice, it was a sound like wind, but wind that seemed to be forming patterns. Wind that seemed almost to be breathing. At 2:47 a.m., the dogs they brought in from the local village replacements for the 3 that had died began barking. Not alert barks, terror barks. They strained at their leashes, pulling in a direction that pointed toward the eastern edge of camp. Captain Reinhardt was in the command tent. Sergeant Hale was with him. The alert came through. Possible contact, eastern perimeter. Both men moved quickly into the darkness. What happened next exists in the historical record in fragments, because not everyone survived to give a full account. What we know comes from debriefs, from letters, from the journal of Private Whitmore, and from an interview with Sergeant Hale that was conducted in 1970 but kept sealed until 2015. The perimeter guards at the eastern sector reported seeing movement in the snow, a large shape, tall, wrong proportions, moving between the trees with a kind of fluid grace that didn't match any known animal behavior. Orders to fire were given. Gunfire erupted into the night, the chaos of it, the sound carrying across the valley, the muzzle flashes bright against the white. Bullets seemed to strike the shape. The soldiers swore they hit it, but the shape didn't fall. It didn't even seem to slow down. And then it was gone. Just the sound of men breathing hard, coming down from adrenaline. Captain Reinhardt ordered a ceasefire. He organized a search team. He wanted proof, evidence, something concrete that could be explained. What they found was a patch of disturbed snow where the shape had been. Tracks, if they could be called that. They didn't match any known animal. They looked almost human, but the stride length was too great. The depth of the impression suggested immense weight, and when the soldiers examined the area more carefully, they found something else. One of the soldiers on the search team, Private Eugene Marcello, discovered what he initially thought was part of the shape they'd been shooting at. A piece of something. He reached down to touch it. Immediately, men around him heard him gasp, not scream, just a sound of shock and revulsion. When they looked at what he was holding, they saw what appeared to be tissue, flesh. But it was black, not naturally black. It looked burned or rotted or something between the two. It felt wrong in a way that went beyond the merely disgusting. It felt like something that shouldn't exist in the natural world. The piece of tissue dissolved in Marcello's hand. It turned to something like ash and then to nothing. Within seconds, there was no evidence it had ever existed. What happened after the initial encounter is documented in Whitmore's journal and in Sergeant Hale's debriefing. The attack, if it can be called, that hadn't stopped. It had paused. Around 3:30 a.m., there was a sound from the isolation room where Soros was being held. A crash of breaking wood. Soldiers nearest to the structure heard it and moved to investigate. When they reached the building, they found the small window smashed, and on the ground, scattered around the window, were fragments of bone. The door was still locked. The window was too small for a man to fit through. But Soros was gone. What remained was blood on the inside of the window frame, and bone fragments that were the wrong size and shape to be entirely human. Captain Reinhardt made a command decision that amounted to an admission of defeat, though he wouldn't have phrased it that way. He ordered the company to prepare for immediate evacuation. They would gather critical supplies, leave in a coordinated movement, and make their way south to the next forward position. The camp would be abandoned. It was a reasonable decision. It was also a decision made by a man who had lost control of the situation and was trying to salvage lives from a disaster he didn't understand. The evacuation began at 400 am. Company strength was assembled, supplies were gathered. Wounded men who couldn't travel far were prepared for the journey. The plan was to move south through the mountain passes, using the darkness and the snow as cover. But before they could depart, something happened that changed everything. The thing came through the main gate. According to multiple accounts, it simply walked through. Soldiers were stationed there, armed and alert. They saw it approach. They issued warnings. They fired. The thing kept coming. The first full description of what the soldiers saw comes from Private Whitmore's journal, which somehow survived the events that followed. His handwriting is shaky, his account fragmented, but it's the closest thing we have to a real-time account from someone who witnessed it. It came through the gate like nothing could stop it. Tall. So tall, 7 feet maybe, but wrong-shaped, stretched, like something was pulling it from the inside out. The head was almost not a head. I can't describe it better than that, like something was wearing a human shape and doing it wrong. The arms had too many joints. When it moved in ways that didn't match how bodies are supposed to move. The smell hit us before it got close. Not an animal smell. Not a dead smell, like burning metal and something rotten and something else I don't have words for. Where John's bobbing. The guns wouldn't stop it. Bullets went through it, and it didn't matter. It kept coming. What followed was brief but catastrophic. The soldiers in the company reacted with discipline initially, falling back to prepared positions, trying to create distance. But the thing that had come through the gate moved with purpose, and it moved fast. It reached the first cluster of soldiers before they could fully establish a defensive line. Sergeant Marcus Hale was in that first group. His account, given years later, is almost clinical in its detachment. The detachment of a man who survived something so horrific that he'd processed it into a kind of numb description. It took Jenkins first, just reached out and grabbed him. Jenkins was a strong guy, maybe 230 pounds, strong as anyone in the company. This thing grabbed him and held him at arm's length, and there was this sound. I still hear it sometimes in dreams, like something being unmade, like the sound of bones breaking, except also like the sound of fabric tearing, and something else underneath that. When it dropped him, Jenkins wasn't Jenkins anymore. The shape was wrong. The thing that came out of that uniform wasn't that thing anymore. Followed. The thing moved through the camp with methodical purpose, seeking out isolated groups, separating men from the main body, taking what it wanted. Men fought with bayonets and rifle butts. They threw grenades. They tried to tackle it. Nothing worked. It was as if they were trying to kill something that operated on a different plane of existence than they did. Captain Reinhardt, seeing the situation collapsing, made the only decision that might have saved some lives. He ordered a full retreat. Not an organized retreat, a break. Get out of the camp, scatter, move south, meet up in the valley below if possible. It was chaos. Men running in the darkness and the snow, carrying wounded, leaving behind supplies and equipment, trying to get away from something that should have been impossible. Private Whitmore survived this part. He made it out of the camp and into the woods, running downslope, moving with a group of maybe 6 or 7 men. He kept running until dawn, when visibility improved enough to see what they were running toward. The mountains opened up before them. Snow-covered slopes, dark forests, the promise of distance. Behind them, the camp was no longer visible, but Whitmore wrote about what he felt in those moments of dawn light. The sense that it was still coming, that distance didn't matter, that whatever was chasing us, it knew how to move through these mountains, and we didn't. The journey south took 4 days. Captain Reinhardt led approximately 70 soldiers. More than half the company had been killed or captured or simply disappeared in the chaos. The route was treacherous. Men were exhausted. The wounded couldn't keep up. And every night as the sun set, the sounds would start. Sounds of something moving through the trees, sounds of something that shouldn't exist. On the second night, they lost Private Robert Chen, the radio operator. He'd been at the back of the column, keeping watch. When the column stopped, he didn't report in. A search revealed nothing. He was simply gone. On the third night, they found him. He was waiting on the trail ahead of them, standing absolutely still in the moonlight. He was wearing his uniform, but it fit wrong, like he'd been changed. And the uniform hadn't adjusted. His eyes were open, but not responsive. When Captain Reinhardt approached him and spoke his name, Chen's head turned with an unnatural motion. But the voice that came out wasn't Chen's voice. It was the same distorted sound that had come through the radio frequency. The sound made men recoil. Reinhardt didn't hesitate. He put a bullet in Chen's head. According to Hale's account, the body didn't bleed normally. It fell, and the wound that should have been fatal simply sealed itself, or something like it. Within moments, it looked like Chen was going to get back up. Hale shot him again. Then again. The third bullet seemed to work. The body stopped moving, but the smell, the same burning metal and rotten smell from the camp, began to fill the air. They left Chen on the trail and moved on. Private Whitmore wrote about this moment. We left him there, and I felt like something in me died in that moment. Not from grief. From the knowledge that whatever was chasing us, it could take one of us and wear him like clothes, and we'd have to kill him ourselves. That's a special kind of horror that I don't think I ever fully recovered from. On the fourth day, they reached the southern camp, exhausted, decimated, traumatized, but alive. No mention of Soros's disappearance and return. No mention of Chen's transformation. No mention of anything that couldn't be explained by conventional warfare. There were reasons for this. First, Reinhardt was an officer, and officers protect themselves and their orders. Second, reporting the truth would have meant explaining something that couldn't be explained, and military documentation doesn't accommodate the impossible. Third, men who'd survived wanted to move on. They wanted to forget. They wanted to not be the crazy soldiers who claimed to have seen something. But soldiers talk, and letters home contain truths that official reports don't. In the months that followed the evacuation, men from Bravo Company sought psychiatric evaluation. Some claimed to have nightmares. Some claimed to hear sounds that distorted radio voice, appearing sometimes in the half-sleep between dreaming and waking. Some claimed that certain spaces felt wrong, like the thing was still following them, still present in some way they couldn't quite articulate. Private Whitmore returned home to Kentucky in March 1944. He got a job at a hardware store. He married. He had 3 children. But his wife, in an interview given to a researcher in 1992, described him as fundamentally changed. He never talked about the war in any detail, but sometimes, late at night, I'd find him standing at the window, looking out at nothing, with this expression on his face like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. And once, just once, he said something that I never forgot. He said, "It never left. It's still out there, and it's still looking." Sergeant Marcus Hale suffered worse. He had nightmares consistently. For decades, he became isolated, withdrawn. He had 3 marriages, all of which ended in divorce. In 1970, when he gave his official account to military historians, he wept multiple times while describing the events. He died in 1995, and his suicide note, which was kept private by his family, mentioned the thing multiple times. Captain Reinhardt lived until 1960s. He retired from the Army with full honors, but he was haunted. According to his daughter, who gave an interview late in her life, her father would sometimes look at her and ask, "Is this right? Is your face right?" Like he was checking to confirm that the people around him were actually who they appeared to be. He spent his final years in psychiatric care, making references to "the time I chose the wrong thing," without ever elaborating. Of the 70 men who made it out of the camp at Kochi, 7 eventually died by suicide. 14 experienced psychotic breaks. 21 struggled with severe PTSD decades after the war ended. Now, here's where we have to address the obvious question: what was it? The official military record lists the Kochi incident as a minor engagement with unclear outcomes. German intelligence records from the same period mention nothing about the area. Albanian resistance fighters who later gave interviews said they'd heard rumors of something in the mountains, but nothing concrete. Some historians suggest that what happened was a combination of stress, isolation, and misidentification, that soldiers, pushed to the edge of their psychological tolerance, simply misinterpreted events. Perhaps it was a German patrol, distorted by fear and darkness. Perhaps it was an animal, a bear, moving in an unusual way, seeming larger than it actually was because of the terrain and the light. But this doesn't account for the objective elements of the story. The deaths, the disappearances, the way Soros came back changed, the way Chen had to be shot multiple times, the physical descriptions from multiple independent sources that were consistent in their details. There are also records from Albanian folklore, recorded orally for centuries, some written down in the early 1900s that describe creatures in the mountains that move like men but aren't men. Creatures that were said to take people and change them, or to wear human skin without understanding how. These creatures were called by various names depending on the region. In the mountains near Kochi, they were sometimes called Vesh Treesa, which roughly translates to the shape taker. Are these accounts of the same phenomenon, or is folklore simply folklore stories that persist because stories do, regardless of whether they're based on anything real? The truth is, we don't know. The documents that would confirm what happened have been lost or destroyed. The soldiers who witnessed it are almost all dead, and the few interviews that were conducted decades after the fact are colored by trauma, time, and the natural human tendency to both magnify and minimize experiences that were genuinely unsettling. What we're left with is a story that's internally consistent, a story that multiple sources corroborate in its broad outlines, even when the details differ. A story that fits into a framework of documented military history while simultaneously defying rational explanation. Consider what we know about the human mind under extreme stress. Soldiers in combat experience things that can't be fully explained through normal psychology. They see patterns that don't exist. They perceive threats that are more imagined than real. They experience collective hallucinations under certain conditions. But we also know that humans are terrible at perceiving things they have no framework for. When something doesn't match our expectations, we often misidentify it. We project familiar patterns onto unfamiliar phenomena. Yet there's another framework we might consider. Throughout human history, across cultures that had no contact with each other, there are consistent reports of entities that don't fit into our normal categories. Not quite animal, not quite human. Something that moves like a predator but thinks in ways humans can't quite grasp. Indigenous peoples from dozens of regions have stories about such things. Some stories suggest they're supernatural. Others suggest they're simply animals that don't live where modern humans usually live, or don't appear where they can be studied. The 1940s were, in many ways, a different era. It was possible for things to happen in remote locations and never be fully documented. It was possible for military records to be classified and lost. It was possible for truth to be buried under bureaucracy, and the natural tendency of institutions to deny what can't be easily explained. The question, then, is not whether what happened at Kochi fits into our current understanding of biology and natural history. The question is whether our current understanding is complete. Private Whitmore's final journal entry, written in 1952 when he was 28 years old, reads, "I've had 10 years to try to understand what we saw in those mountains. I don't think understanding is possible. Some things exist outside the boundaries of what we're supposed to comprehend. Something hunted us, and we barely escaped. And sometimes I wonder if we actually did escape, or if part of what was chasing us came with us and is waiting for something." He never elaborated on what that something might be. The camp at Kochi was abandoned after the evacuation. In the winter of 1944, a reconnaissance team was sent to document the site before it could be reclaimed by nature or enemy forces. The official report noted that the camp had been extensively damaged, cause unclear. There were no signs of German occupation. The camp simply looked like a place where something terrible had occurred, and no one wanted to examine too closely what that might have been. In the decades since, Kochi has remained largely untouched. The valley where the camp stood is inaccessible for much of the year. If anything remained there, equipment, supplies, evidence it would likely have been reclaimed by the earth by now. The soldiers who survived moved on with their lives, but they carried Kochi with them. They carried it in their silences. They carried it in the way they reacted to certain sounds or smells. They carried it in the relationships that couldn't quite form, the friendships that couldn't quite deepen, the sense of living slightly apart from the rest of the world because they'd seen something the rest of the world wasn't equipped to understand. Was what they experienced real? The evidence suggests yes. Documented, yes, with medical records and military reports and personal testimonies that align in their major details. Explainable? That's a different question. There are things in the world that exist in the margins of what we understand, things that most of us will never encounter, things that some soldiers stumbled upon in the winter of 1943 in the mountains of Albania, far from home, far from help, far from any framework they could use to process what they were experiencing. Or at least it's as close as we can get to their story, constructed from fragments and testimonies and letters written in the quiet moments between nightmares. Whether you believe it happened as described, whether you think it's a mixture of real events and trauma-induced distortion, whether you think it's something else entirely, that's up to you, but know this. Somewhere in the world, there are still places where mountains rise high enough to touch secrets, where darkness runs deep enough to hide things we haven't named, where people sometimes don't come back the same as they left. And some of those places might still be occupied by whatever was hunting Bravo Company in December 1943. That's the story we have today on Trench Shadows. If you're listening to this, thank you. If this story affected you, unsettled you, made you question the boundaries of what's possible, that's exactly what these stories are meant to do. Well, I want to hear what you think. Do you believe what happened at Kochi was real? Or do you think the soldiers' minds constructed a monster from the stress and isolation of war? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Discussions about these stories matter, because together we're trying to understand the edges of human experience where documented history and folklore intersect. If you're new to Trench Shadows, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories that history tried to bury. We explore war legends, unexplained encounters, and the dark folklore that surrounds military history. These are the stories that matter, the ones that changed the people who lived through them. And if you've made it this far, if you've spent this time with us, thank you. Come back again. There are more stories to tell. This is Trench Shadows. We'll see you next time.